talk with you about ethics in local government. I understand some of you may have received training in the past on this subject. We have lots to cover. I hope to get it all done within an hour. But if I go over, please excuse me. I'll leave some time at the end to address any questions that you may have. So we're going to, as I mentioned, going to cover a lot of ground this morning. And here's a roadmap of what we're going to cover. First, we're going to talk about what are ethics, and why are they important to us? Where do our ethics laws, rules, and regulations come from? What are conflicts of interest under New York State law? What is a prohibited interest in a contract under New York State law? What interests in contracts must be disclosed under New York State law? Then we're going to talk about a concept of appearances of impropriety, limits on gifts, limits on the use of the village's confidential information, limits on compensation, whistleblower protection, and then a survey of the village's code of ethics and a role of its board of ethics. And this PowerPoint presentation will be sent out to all of you, and you'll see that it'll have a helpful summary of all of what's contained under Chapter 7 of the Village Code, which is its code of ethics. So why are ethics important to us? First, we have to remember that we're all public servants. It's our duty to make sure that we put the public's interests in front of ours. So to have a clear code of ethics makes sure that that occurs. We want to reassure the public in their faith in government. So having a code of ethics that people can point to and know that their elected officials and their employees of the village are abiding by will reassure that faith in government. As I mentioned, a written code of ethics sets clear guidelines so that both the employees and elected officials know within what the frame that they have to operate within. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for all of you, is ethics protect innocent public officers and employees from unwarranted attacks on their integrity. So, and we'll talk about this at the end, use the Board of Ethics as a tool. If you have an issue that you believe may require, you have a concern about it, go to the Board of Ethics. Ask for an advisory opinion. Have them look into it, and then you'll have the confidence in going forward. So what are the principal sources of ethics regulations under New York State and local law? First and foremost, Article 18 of the General Municipal Law sets forth the state's overarching guidelines with respect to ethics here. Secondly, and more importantly for all of us convened today, is the village's own code of ethics. And the village's code of ethics is far more detailed than Article 18 of the General Municipal Law, and that's not uncommon among local municipalities. There's also the gift prohibition under Article 8, Section 1 of the New York State Constitution. And then there are various ethics laws, rules, and regulations that are interspersed in both in common law and in the state's statutes. So let's start at the beginning. What is a conflict of interest? In general, a conflict of interest arises when a municipal officer or employee has a personal interest that tends to make his or her judgment less protective of the municipality's interest. Essentially, if a public servant is placed in a position where it's possible that they may place their own interests ahead of the public's. So this is Article 18. This is the rule, as it were, for under New York State law. So under General Municipal Law, Section 801, municipal officers and employees, and we'll talk about that definition in a moment, are prohibited from having an interest in a contract with the municipality when they have a power or duty, either individually or as a member of the municipal board, to negotiate, prepare, authorize, or approve the contract, to authorize or approve payment thereunder, to audit bills or claims under the contract, or appoint an officer or employee who has any powers or duties set forth above. So what municipalities does this apply to? Essentially every municipality, state, local, special districts. It's easier to point out what municipality or governmental bodies are not covered. For our purposes, we are covered as a village. Which municipal officers and employees are covered? All of you. all of you must abide, except for the note that I have there that talks about volunteer firefighters. All of us are covered under the state's code of ethics as well as the village's code of ethics. What is an interest? And this is important, and this is where some of the digging needs to occur. An interest is defined as a direct or indirect pecuniary, which means monetary benefit, accruing to an individual as a result of a contract they have with the municipality, for which they also serve as an officer or employee. Municipal officers and employees are deemed under the law to have an interest in any of the following situations: where his or her spouse, minor children, and dependents accept a contract of employment with the municipality which the officer or employee serves. That means if a sibling, or if a child of an elected official were to work for a government, that's not an interest per se. There's issues with nepotism. We'll talk about that later. A firm, partnership, or association of which the officer or employee is a member or employee. A corporation of which the officer or employee is an officer, director, or employee. A corporation, any stock of which is owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the officer or employee. This requires both a factual and legal analysis, determining whether an interest exists. First, if any of the four criteria that we just discussed on the previous slide occurs, that is deemed under the law to be an interest. But there's also a factual analysis that we have to undertake. If there's a direct or indirect interest could exist outside of those four relationships. For example, if a village or officer or employee lives with the contractor to the village, and the contractor or cohabitant, the person living with them, contributes towards rent and utilities, the village officer or employee would therefore have a direct pecuniary interest in the contract between their cohabitant and the village. So they're receiving a direct benefit by virtue of that person. And that's why there's a factual interest there. What is a contract? Again, this is another very broad definition. A contract is any claim, account, or demand against or agreement with the municipality, whether it's express or implied. Examples of contracts: obviously purchase or sale agreements, leases, construction agreements, service contracts, payment vouchers, any claims that you'd submit to the municipality, and even a lawsuit, which is kind of counterintuitive. If you were to bring a lawsuit against the municipality, that would be a claim. What powers and duties can give rise to a prohibited interest? So these are what we were talking about earlier. This is what's known as the control element of a prohibited interest. If the officer or employee has the power to negotiate, prepare, authorize, or approve the contract, if they have the ability to authorize or approve payment under the contract, audit bills or claims under the contract, or appoint an officer or employee who has any of these powers. There are also special prohibitions that are applicable to financial officers of a municipality. This only applies to chief fiscal officers and treasurers. They're prevented from picking which banks the village's funds can be deposited within. Let's talk about how to analyze potential conflicts of interest. First, we need to determine whether a contract exists. As we've talked about before, a contract is any claim, account, or demand against agreement with the municipality, express or implied. Secondly, we need to determine, does the officer or employee have an interest in that contract? Again, that's the factual legal analysis we talked about just a moment ago. Third, does the person have the discretionary powers, those are the control powers, as outlined under General Municipal Law 801? And finally, if the answer to each of those questions is yes, then we have to do an analysis to see whether any of the exceptions under Section 802 of the General Municipal Law apply. Now, there are 17 exceptions under the General Municipal Law. We'll talk about a few of the more common ones now. First, there's the compensation and expenses exception. Obviously, a municipal officer or employee couldn't have a conflict of interest in their employment agreement, or if they were to submit travel vouchers for reimbursement Then there's the duties and remuneration exemption. Having an interest that is prohibited solely because the municipal officer works for a person or firm that has a municipal contract, where the municipal officer or employee is only an officer or employee and not the owner of the firm, has nothing to do with the contract at the firm, and will not have his or her compensation or other remuneration at the firm affected by the contract. In other words, if the officer or employee of the village is merely an employee of the vendor, the contractee, that would not pose a problem. However, if the elected officer or employee were the owner of that contractor or had an ownership in that enterprise, that would manifest as a prohibited interest. Contracts with not-for-profits, there's no pecuniary gain there, so there's no, obviously that's an exception. Pre-existing contracts, so if the village officer or employee had previously an interest before joining the village, that would predate their involvement, so no issue there. Minimal stock holdings, this kind of dovetails to what we were just discussing in terms of ownership. If the ownership is so small, less than 5% under state law, and also happens to be less than 5% under the village's code, that's a de minimis ownership interest, so wouldn't give rise to a prohibited conflict. And then there are small value contracts exception. So if a contract is less than $750, it's de minimis. There's no reason, that's an exception under the law. The next most important concept we're going to talk about is disclosure of interest in contracts. And here's essentially what the takeaway message on this is. If you believe you may have an interest in a contract that is presently pending before the village, err on the side of safety and disclose that interest in writing to the village clerk. That way you're covered, the village is covered, and that would resolve any issues. Under General Municipal Law, Section 803, if your municipal officer or employee has, will have, or later acquires an interest in an actual or proposed contract, purchase agreement, lease agreement, or other agreement, including an oral agreement, with his or her municipality, he must publicly disclose the interest. This disclosure also applies to your spouse. So if your spouse has an interest or may have an interest in a village contract, disclose it. Just get it out of the way. Don't invite an issue. And disclosure by the official must be made public in writing and state the nature and extent of the interest. So, for example, my spouse has an interest in the carting company the village uses. Her name is X and she lives at X. That will suffice. The disclosure must be made to the official's immediate supervisor and to the governing body of the municipality as soon as it is known. Your best bet is to disclose it to the village clerk, and that way it'll be part of the village's record. There are also a separate obligation of disclosure of interests in real estate applications, and this is governed under Section 809 of the General Municipal Law, which provides that land use applications must state the name, residence, and nature and extent of any state officer or any officer or employee of the subject municipality in the person, partnership, or association making the application, petition, or request to the extent known to the applicant. This is in all likelihood built into the village's current applications. What happens if there's a violation of General Municipal Law, Article 18? So any contract which is willfully entered into by or with a municipality in which there is a prohibited interest will be null, void, and wholly unenforceable. And any municipal officer or employee who willfully and knowingly violates these provisions will be guilty of a misdemeanor. And I have the definitions of willfully and knowingly there. So let's talk about the application of conflict of interest and disclosure laws. If the municipal officer or employee has an interest in a contract with the municipality and control over that contract and no exception applies, then the interest is prohibited. Now, some folks think that, all right, I could simply recuse or abstain from voting on that contract and that will absolve the issue. That's not true under prohibited interest in contracts. We're going to talk about appearance of impropriety soon. In those instances, which are common law conflicts of interest, those recusal and abstention will serve to save that contract. If the municipal officer or employee has an interest in a contract with the municipality and no control over that contract, again, we talked about control, that's the ability to negotiate, to audit payments, etc., then the interest is not prohibited, but the official still must disclose the interest. If the municipal officer or employee has an interest in a contract with the municipality and control over the contract, and one of the exceptions under General Municipal Law 802.1 applies, the interest is not prohibited, but the official must disclose the interest. And 802.1 talks about employment contracts with the village. If the municipal officer or employee has an interest in a contract with the municipality and control over the contract, but one of the exceptions in General Municipal Law 802 Section 2 applies, which are the 17 exceptions, some of which we talked about, then the interest is not prohibited and the official need not disclose the interest. Let's talk about some examples. I think this is easily the best way to comprehend and understand this. So, does a clerk treasurer have a prohibited conflict of interest in a contract between his or her spouse and the village in relation to a construction of a shed for the village? Let's go through our analysis. First question, does a contract exist? Yes, a contract between the village and the spouse of the clerk treasurer to build a shed. The next level of questions, does the officer or employee have an interest in that contract? Yes, the clerk treasurer is deemed to have an interest in the contract between their spouse and the village. That's one of the legal interests that we were talking about. Does the person have discretionary powers in relation to the contract? No, the clerk treasurer does not have discretion. And this one's kind of nuanced because you'd think the clerk treasurer would have the ability, since they're governing the village's budget. That's not the case. The village board is charged with reviewing and auditing all claims. They're in charge with negotiating the contract. The clerk's treasurer role is more ministerial in function. So if the answer is yes to each of the foregoing, does an exception apply? Here, there is no prohibited interest. However, since the clerk treasurer has an interest in the contract, they must disclose that interest to, in this case, they'd be disclosing it to the board because the clerk can't disclose to themselves. Example 2, does a village board member who is also president, director, and stockholder holding in excess of 5% of the stock of a corporation engaged in the paving business have a prohibited interest if the village enters into a contract with that corporation? Again, our analysis. Does a contract exist? Yes, there's a contract for paving. Does the officer or employee have an interest in the contract? Yes. A trustee is deemed to have an interest under the legal definitions we talked about earlier. And they're also an officer, director, and employee, and have, in this case, ownership of at least more than 5% stock in the company. Does the person have discretionary powers or the control element we talked about? Yes. The trustee here has the ability to negotiate the paving contract and is also charged with auditing the bills and claims that are submitted under that contract. If yes to each of the foregoing questions, does an exception apply? Here, no exception applies. The trustee owns more than 5% of the paving company's stock, and the exception that we talked about under Section 802.2 doesn't apply. Or any disclosure is required. No disclosures are required because the village is prohibited from entering into the contract to begin with. So even if the trustee were to say, I'm not going to participate in addressing this contract, I'm going to leave the room, you trustees, you decide. That won't solve this issue. The village can enter into that contract, and if the village were to enter into that contract, it would be legally null and void. And if they knew they were entering into that contract with a prohibited interest, it could be a misdemeanor. Example 3, we've changed the fact pattern just subtly, but it makes a big difference. Does a village board member who owns less than 5% of the stock of a corporation engaged in the paving business have a prohibited interest if the village enters into a contract with the corporation? Here, same analysis. There's a contract for paving. Yes, the trustee has an interest in the contract under the law. Do they have discretionary powers? Yes, they do. But here, the exception under Section 802.2 applies, since the ownership interest is less than that 5% threshold, and it has a de minimis amount. And are there any disclosures required? No disclosures are required because the exception under 802.2 applies. 803 says if the exception under 802 applies, then you don't have to disclose it. Final example we'll go through. Does a mayor have a prohibited conflict of interest in the purchase of a surplus vehicle from the municipality? What effect will competitive bidding and recusal have on the outcome of that, if any? Again, we go through our analysis. Yes, there's a contract for the sale of the surplus vehicle. The mayor has a statutory interest because they're receiving a material benefit, in this case the vehicle. Does the person have discretionary powers? Certainly the mayor has the ability to negotiate and approve the sale of the purchase of the vehicle and probably to sign the contract. Does any of the exceptions apply? No exception applies. And competitive bidding or recusal, like we mentioned, doesn't help. Are any disclosures required? Again, no, because the contract couldn't have been entered into in the first instance. We're now going to talk about the common law conflict of interest issues, and this is what you may have heard of, the appearance of impropriety. An appearance of impropriety results when an officer's personal situation may affect the public's perception of his or her ability to act impartially and in the best interest of the taxpayers of a whole. Public officials are urged to avoid even the appearance of an impropriety. So for an example of an appearance of impropriety, a contract with the trustee's uncle's karting business. Certainly the public can see that there's a familial relationship, that there's a likelihood that the trustee could inure some kind of benefit or favoritism towards the uncle's contracting business, and the public may have serious questions about that. So what the New York Attorney General advises with respect to those kinds of issues, an appearance of impropriety, since there's no prohibited conflict, here recusal and abstention would be an okay solution. So the trustee should say, I can't participate in this discussion. I have a familial relationship with the karting business. I'm going to abstain, and I'll step out of the room, and the rest of the trustees can decide on whether or not to enter into the contract. And here's just a quote from former Chief Justice of the New York State Court of Appeals. A trustee is held something stricter than the morals of the marketplace, not honesty alone, but the punctilio of an honor the most sensitive is then the standard of behavior. It is not necessary, however, that a specific provision of the general municipal law be violated before there can be an improper conflict of interest. Here are some other issues under the general municipal law that you should be wary of. Gifts, especially now around the holiday season. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. No municipal officer or employee shall directly or indirectly solicit any gift or accept or receive any gift having a value of $75 or more in any form under circumstances in which it could reasonably infer that the gift was intended to influence him or her, or could reasonably expect it to influence him or her in the performance of his or her official duties, or was intended as a reward for any official action on his or her part. Now that $75 could, it doesn't necessarily have to be a lump sum, it could be an aggregate of things adding up to that $75 threshold. The next thing you should be wary of is the disclosure or the prohibition against the disclosure of confidential information. No municipal officer or employee can disclose or personally use confidential municipal material that they've obtained in the course of their official duties. Also, there's a compensation prohibition. No municipal officer or employee can receive compensation for services relating to a matter before their own municipal agency or a municipal agency over which they have jurisdiction. An example of this would be if a trustee were an attorney and they were to attempt to appear on behalf of a client before the board in relation to an application, that would be prohibited. penalties for violations of this section of the general municipal law. So any officer or employee that knowingly and intentionally violates any of those provisions we just discussed may be fined, suspended, or removed from office or employment in a manner provided by law. And there are mechanisms both under state law and also village law perhaps to remove public officers or employees with respect to those kinds of things. Just some general other aspects of Article 18, the state law we were talking about. Cities and villages, in fact, the state wants cities and villages and local governments to establish their own code of ethics. The village of Southampton certainly has established a code of ethics. It's quite comprehensive. The state also would like local governments to establish their own board of ethics, and that's what Section 808 does. The state allows local governments to create annual financial disclosures. There is a financial disclosure requirement under village code. And then separate and apart from Article 18, the other aspect of village ethics that pops up frequently is compatibility of office. And this is something that I could spend an entire hours on discussing, because it's really born from common law and you have to study each specific situation in order to resolve it. But compatibility of office issues essentially talk about limiting, place limits on whether someone could hold two offices simultaneously. You can't hold two offices if one is subordinate to the other. In other words, you can't be your own boss. Or if there's an inherent inconsistency between the two offices. And the definition of inherent inconsistency, I can't define that for you today, as we'd get way into the weeds and we don't have time. But for an example of you can't be your own boss, a mayor, for example, could not also serve as the director of recreation in a village, because the mayor would be supervising themselves essentially, and also you could think of situations where the mayor in that instance would decide to spend more money on the budget for the recreation department that they're overseeing rather than other aspects of village government. New York State whistleblower protection. This is something that everybody should be aware of. It's certainly posted on bulletin boards and whatnot. So New York Civil Service Law Section 75B protects public employees from retaliation for revealing unlawful conduct. In order to invoke whistleblower protection, the public employee must disclose certain information to the governmental body. And the governmental body doesn't necessarily mean the village's government. It could mean that the employee goes to law enforcement, the state attorney general, for example. And if they go to the attorney general's office and say, listen, I believe that there is some fraud going on in the village and I want to tell you about it, if the village were to retaliate, excuse me, against that employee for disclosing that information, that would be against the law. In addition to the whistleblower protection under the New York State False Claims Act, individuals who believe that there has been fraud occurring in government could bring their own civil litigation on behalf of the government. These are known as qui tam actions. Basically, it's a private right of action for fraud and waste. So here we're going to talk about the specifics of the village's code of ethics. And the village code of ethics is contained under Chapter 7 of the village code, and it's very detailed. And what I've tried to do here, and I hope it is all helpful to all of you, is summarize each of the most relevant provisions. And again, you'll each receive a copy of this PowerPoint, and you can use it as a handy reference point. Forgive me for reading these, but they are summarized. So who is covered under the village code of ethics? The ethics code applies to all officer employees of the village, whether paid or unpaid, including members of any village department, agency, board, or commission, and that's section 7.3A of the village code. Certain provisions of the code also cover village contractors and vendors and other people who have dealings with the village and village employees. We'll talk about it later, but independent contractors to the village are also subject to the village's code of ethics. Misuse of office. Village officials or employees may not use their position, and this dovetails in the state prohibition, or official powers and duties to secure a material benefit, financial or otherwise, for themselves, their family members, or anyone with whom they have a business or financial relationship. Similarly to state law, family members, village officials or employees may not, either individually or as a member of the village board or commission, appoint, hire, promote, discipline, or discharge or supervise a relative or household member. This is commonly known as the nepotism prohibition. Misuse of village resources. Village officials or employees may not use village personnel, compensated time, money, vehicles, equipment, materials, supplies, or other resources for non-village purposes. Incidental or minimal personal use is sometimes permissible. So if you need to use the village's phone, or you need to print something de minimis, that's not an issue. But if you're using the village's pickup truck to move your brother-in-law into their new apartment, that's something else. Recusal. Village officials, employees may not take or participate in any decision or take any official action when he or she knows that the action may confer a direct or indirect material, financial, or other benefit on a person or entity that would create the appearance of impropriety. So here's the codification of the recusal that the Attorney General's office had suggested when an appearance of propriety exists. Inducement of others. Village officials, employees, and independent contractors of the village may not try to cause, or help another official, employee, or independent contractor to violate the code of ethics. That's just common sense. Private employment in conflict with official duties. Village officials and employees may not engage in any secondary employment or business or commercial or professional activities where such secondary employment or business, commercial, or professional activity conflict with the official duties of the village official or employee. If you're contemplating secondary employment, I urge you to ask for an opinion from the Board of Ethics. They'll help you navigate that. They can explain whether or not it's permissible. Don't just take that job. Go to the Board of Ethics. Your request is confidential. They'll treat it confidential, and they'll get back to you promptly in order to resolve that issue so that you can move on with your life. Here's the village's gift prohibition. During a 12-month period, village officials and employees may not accept anything valued, and this is consistent with state law, at $75 or more from anyone they know or should know is doing business or seeking to do business with the village. A gift that is given as a reward for performing an official duty or that is intended to influence an employee's performance violates the ethics provision, even if it is less than 75. So there's one instance where the village code is actually more strict than state law. Personal representation and claims, and this is the compensation issue that we were talking about now under village law. Village officials and employees are prohibited from representing non-village interests before a village agency. They may, however, represent their own interests or the interests of a relative, dependent, or member of their household before a village agency. Village officials, employees, and independent contractors may not seek or accept village services, benefits, or use village facilities unless on the same terms and conditions as are available to village residents or a class of similarly situated residents. Obviously, this again is an example where you need to ensure as public servants that you're placing the public's interests ahead of your own. Village officers, employees, and independent contractors may not assert a claim against the village. They may, however, assert a claim on their own behalf or on behalf of a relative or member of their household, unless the claim is prohibited by contract or general municipal law, section 801. And again, we talked about lawsuits before as being a prohibited contract. And here's the village's contracts provision, which is the equivalent of the Article 18 under state law. Village officials and employees cannot have an interest in any contract with the village when the village official or employee, individually or as a member of a board or commission, has the power or duty to negotiate, prepare, authorize, or approve the contract or payments under it, audit bills or claims under the contract, or appoint an officer or employee who has any of the foregoing powers or duties. Village officials and employees must immediately publicly disclose any interest in a village contract to their immediate supervisor and the Board of Ethics. Seeking other jobs. Again, this is if you're contemplating seeking another job while simultaneously occupying a village position, please talk with the Board of Ethics. There's a post-employment 1-year ban. So for 1 year after you leave public village service, village officials and employees may not appear before the village on behalf of anyone else. They can, however, appear before the village on the village's behalf, if the village were to hire them, for example, their own behalf, or on behalf of another governmental agency with the approval of the Board of Ethics, and by making application to their former agency. So they need to go to their whatever department they were assigned to, talk with their supervisor, obtain the supervisor's approval, then make application to the village Board of Ethics, and if they approve, then you can go forward. Post-employment permanent ban. After leaving village service, former village officials and employees may never work for a private employer on a particular matter they personally and substantially worked on for the village. They can, however, work on behalf of the state or a political subdivision or instrumentality of the state, or on behalf of the village with the approval, again, of the village Board of Ethics, and making application to the village agency that they work for. This section can be waived by the Board of Ethics. And again, this is what we're just saying, the post-employment waiver provision that allows the Board of Ethics to entertain and grant a waiver under appropriate circumstances. Then there's under Village Code, a bar against using confidential information that you've obtained during the course of your employment here for your own personal interest. Disclosure and recusal. So, as I mentioned earlier, as soon as a village official or employee is required to recuse himself or herself, he must disclose the conflict to his or her supervisor and immediately file with the village clerk a signed statement disclosing the reasons for recusal. Again, the example we talked about earlier is a spouse who has a contract with the village. You just have to identify the relationship, what the contract is, and the relationship between the two. As soon as a village official or employer or their spouse knows of a conflict of interest in any actual or proposed contract, so it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's sitting on the desk of the trustees for their approval, they must publicly disclose the conflict in writing to their supervisor and the Board of Ethics. Again, village employees must avoid appearances of impropriety whenever they pop up. A village officer, official, employee must disclose an interest in land use applications where the village official or employee is the applicant, an officer, director, partner, or employee of the applicant, legally or beneficially owns or controls stock of the corporate applicant or the partnership. So if you're an owner of a business that has a land use application before the village, you have to disclose that. This is something that is not under state law. It's found in many village codes of ethics. Political activity. Village officials and employees cannot directly or indirectly use their authority or official influence to compel or induce a subordinate village employee or official to make or promise to make any political contribution, whether by gift of money, service, or other thing of value. Village officers and employees also can't act or decline to act in relation to an appointment, hiring, or promoting, discharging, disciplining, or in any way affecting the official rank, status, or compensation of any village official or employee or applicant for village official or employee on the basis of giving or withholding or neglecting to make any contribution or of anything for any political purpose. And then there's finally the whistleblower protection that's codified under village law that we talked about earlier. That's also under state law. The village, as I mentioned, has established an annual financial disclosure for certain village officials. There are certain village officials that are specifically enumerated. Also, the village clerk provides a list of individuals who are what are deemed policy makers to the Village Board of Ethics, who may also have to file annual financial disclosure reports. What are the penalties for violating the Village Code of Ethics? The Board of Ethics may refer any matter to the appropriate prosecutor, so law enforcement, that in its judgment might involve criminal misconduct. The Board of Ethics, after a hearing in accordance with due process procedures, may, in its discretion, recommend to the Village Board of Trustees disciplinary action, initiate an action for damages, civil forfeiture, debarment, or injunctive relief in the Supreme Court of the State of New York. So again, the Board of Ethics here will initially hold the hearing and make a recommendation to the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees will make the decision whether or not to move forward with a civil prosecution if that's what they want to do. Criminal penalties can include violations and misdemeanors punishable by both fine and imprisonment. We talked about that earlier. So let's now talk about the role of the Board of Ethics. I'd like for you all to leave here today knowing that the Board of Ethics is your friend. Yes, no one likes to fill out financial disclosure forms, but they're important. You know, they're used as a means of determining whether conflicts may exist, and they're, it's a shield. We want to protect village employees from unnecessarily stepping into traps where there could be a conflict. Allowing the review of financial disclosures make sure that these requirements are addressed on the front end rather than somebody blowing the whistle and causing a contract that's already been entered into to be unwound. As I mentioned, the Board of Ethics has the ability to investigate complaints and grant waivers under the Code of Ethics and issue advisory opinions. You're sitting here today listening to me because there's a biannual requirement under Village Code for ethics training and for education. We're going to publish this PowerPoint, and this is being videoed so that folks who aren't able to participate today or who are later hired by the village can view this and satisfy their ethics training requirement.
It's biannual, we have to do this twice a year?
No, every other.
Oh, biannual.
Yes. And then finally, the Board of Ethics is required to publish to the Board of Trustees an annual report explaining all of the work it had done for the prior year. I've included here some hyperlinks to some of the laws that I talked about this morning. You're welcome to click on them and study them if you'd like. Perhaps not. Included are Article 18 under the General Municipal Law, the village's own Code of Ethics, the whistleblower law, the false claims law, and a summary that the comptroller had created summarizing Article 18. At this point, I'll take any questions that you might have. Hearing none? None? Okay. Surely.
Say I have a child that wants to work here in the future. Where does the conflict of interest lie with nepotism and all that?
So, I mean, if it's a child if it's a village employee, there should be no conflict except for you could not supervise your child.
Okay,
There-
so as long as I'm not the supervisor.
Right, right,
Okay, so as long as I'm not directly supervising my child.
right.
Okay. So if I was like supervising a department, and my child worked under me, that would be conflict of interest and unethical.
There may be a way around that. You could perhaps identify somebody who would serve as that person's supervisor rather than yourself and have that, but it becomes somewhat complicated. We'd have to take a look at exactly what the roles and responsibilities were. If it's merely if it's non-financial and it's more operational, that may have an an effect on how that's decided. But it's certainly something the Board of Ethics would take a look at.
So it couldn't collect money or anything?
You just don't want to be in a position where you're directly supervising. So, for example, say that your child got into an issue, a disciplinary issue, Obviously, you don't want the public to say, all right, well, the father is going to impose discipline against their child. There's, you know, an appearance of impropriety there, so that's what the statute is, and the code is designed to protect against. Sure.
Susan Steinhardt is chair of the ethics board. As long as you're not a direct supervisor, I think that would be fine.
Okay.
But we'd have to take a look at it, but all good.
I was wondering about village attorneys and other paid employees of the village that serve in advisory roles to various boards and other offices. Are they also public officers or
The village attorney would be a public officer. So yes, they would be required to abide by the village code of ethics. And also, in all likelihood, be subject to the village's annual financial disclosure.
and other sorts of advisors that are not, that are advising the
Yeah.
board, land use advisors and other paid village employees, are they village employees or public officers, if they're advising employees?
I think she's talking about third-party contractors.
So, thank you, Mayor. Yes, under the village code of ethics, independent contractors and contractors to the village are also subject to the village code of ethics. That's done.
If an ethics matter was brought to the Board of Ethics, and the Board of Ethics deemed it not to be an ethics matter, is there any internal appeal process that could be taken, or is that a final decision?
Well, the Board of Ethics would review it. You could take appeal, I guess, to the Board of Ethics, and then
Go
also.
back to the Board of Ethics?
Yes, right. And then the decision would ultimately be presented to the Board of Trustees, and there may be an opportunity also to have the Board of Trustees review it.
Thank you.
Well, I don't understand the question, I'm sorry.
If an ethics matter was referred to the Board of Trustees, and the Board of Trustees deemed it not to be an ethics matter, is there an appeal process?
From the
From the-
Board of Trustees not taking action on it,
Basically, a request for reconsideration.
for the Board of Ethics?
Yeah, for the Board of Ethics.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for all listening to me. Ethics in the morning is a little difficult.
I got some more questions.
Okay.
One more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What if it's a spouse or relative, close relative, owns a business and gets hired to work either in the village? Is that-
They own the business?
Yeah.
There would be a conflict there. Yes, so if.
But they don't, even if, they don't work in the village.
Oh, they don't work
but
for the
spouse-
village.
Correct, just the spouse work for the village. But they own the business.
So if a spouse owns a business that enters into a contract with the village, right? The spouse of a village officer employee enters into a contract with the village for whatever service, there would be a conflict there because the spouse's interest is imputed to the village official.
But I think Mauricio, you're asking only if they were to contract with the village. If your spouse has a business in the village that doesn't do business with the village itself, that's perfectly fine.
That's absolutely correct. I'm only talking about contracts with the village.
Sort of with the village.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Good-
Thank you.